Most people walk into the Vatican and see marble, gold, and centuries of Christian tradition. Tourists photograph the ceilings and whisper in awe. But behind those walls, in the deepest vaults, where few mortals are allowed to walk, sits evidence of something the Church has spent millennia trying to hide. Not just forbidden gospels or suppressed science, but proof of visitors, ancient beings who descended from the stars and shaped human civilization from its very beginning. They called them the Annunaki, the Watchers, the ones who came from above, and the Vatican has known about them all along, not as myth or legend, but as historical fact, documented, translated, understood. The evidence is there, buried in languages only a handful of priests can read, locked in cabinets that require keys passed down through generations. One man saw it. He walked those halls, he read those texts, and when he finally understood what he was looking at, everything changed. His faith shattered, his obedience crumbled, his entire worldview fractured like glass, and he decided the world needed to know. Because once you see the truth about where we came from, you can never unsee it. You can never go back to sleep. What I am about to tell you is not theology. It's archaeology. It's translation. It's the work of a man brave enough to risk everything because silence had become unbearable. Because the truth was eating him alive. The kind of truth that changes you the moment you understand it. It started with an assignment that seemed routine. A young priest, educated, fluent in ancient languages, was called to assist the head archivist. His job was to catalogue some loose documents that had been discovered during renovations in the lower levels. Mundane work, they said. Just organisation. Just filing. Just sorting through texts that no one in the modern Vatican cared about anyway. But when he descended into those corridors, past the official archives where the public records were kept, past the restricted sections marked with Latin inscriptions, past the doors bearing symbols he didn't recognise, he found something different. A room, not on any map he had studied, not listed in any inventory, not even whispered about in the corridors where priests spoke freely. And inside that room, stacks of tablets, not scrolls like the ones in the main collection, not parchment, not books, actual cuneiform tablets, ancient clay, Sumerian. The language predates Latin by thousands of years, the language of ancient Mesopotamia, the language of the oldest known civilization. He recognized the script immediately because he'd spent years studying it. His hands trembled as he picked Nap. The dust came away in clouds, thick and ancient. This was old, really old. The text was clear, despite its age, pressed into clay by stylus hands that lived 5,000 years ago. Precise, deliberate, meant to last. He started reading slowly, his Latin and Aramaic giving way to pure Sumerian comprehension. At first, the passages seemed like ancient king lists, genealogies, records of who begat whom and who ruled when. Nothing unusual for cuneiform documents, standard historical record keeping, but then the numbers appeared. Reigns lasting hundreds of thousands of years. Individual rulers documented as living for 600 years. 1,000 years, longer than any human should ever exist. And then the names connected to the stars, names that appeared again and again, cycling through the centuries, appearing in different regions simultaneously, as if the same beings kept returning to Earth repeatedly across time. He knew those names. He had read them in the Bible, but always in fragmentary form, mentioned in passing, never explained, never contextualized, never placed in the grand narrative. They were just there, mentioned without explanation, like the translators hoped no one would notice. And now he was holding the source material, the original texts that the Bible was referencing, the texts the Bible had been translated from, or drawing from, or deliberately distorting. His supervisor found him standing in the dark, still holding the tablet. The older man's face went pale, not angry, pale, like seeing a ghost, like a man who had hoped this day would never come. He said nothing, He simply took the tablet from the young priest's hands and walked away. But his expression said everything. You have seen what you were never meant to see. And now there is a problem. The Vatican's secret archive is not one room. It is many, dozens of them, layer upon layer of controlled access, each one requiring higher clearance. The young priest was allowed into the outer sections, the ones catalogued officially, the ones the church acknowledges exists, the ones they even show to select scholars and researchers, carefully vetted, carefully monitored. But there were doors beyond those, locked doors, sealed doors, doors that had not been opened in centuries. Doors that required keys only the cardinal archivists possessed. He began to notice patterns in the way information was organized as he worked, not alphabetically, not chronologically, but by restriction level, by how dangerous the church considered the information to be. The further back in time a document went, the more carefully it was guarded. The older the language, the more restricted the access. The more direct the connection to certain words, certain names, certain events, the deeper it was buried. Over months, he learned the geography of secrecy by watching the older priests, by observing which doors got opened when, by noting which documents were handled with white gloves, and which were locked away immediately. He learned which priests had which keys, which corridors led where, which stairwells were used for moving materials no one was supposed to know about. And through careful observation, he began to understand the structure. There was a hierarchy of truth. Some documents were open, thousands of them. Theology, scripture, commentary, administrative records, donation ledgers, papal decrees. Boring enough that no one would care to read them. But alongside them, accessed by different staircases, guarded by different protocols, maintained by different systems, entirely, were the real archives. The ones containing the original texts in their original languages, before translation, before editing, before the meaning was carefully altered to fit church doctrine, before the dangerous parts were removed. One night, overcome with need to understand, he took a risk. He followed an older cardinal through a passage he had never seen. Security was minimal, almost non-existent. Most people followed rules out of habit, out of fear, out of respect for tradition and authority. Breaking those rules felt impossible, not because of external barriers, but because of internal ones. Psychological walls built since childhood. But he pushed through them. Behind the cardinal he glimpsed a room, just for a moment before the cardinal noticed him and waved him back. Long enough to see dozens of clay tablets, arranged in museum-quality display cases. Long enough to see cuneiform texts glinting under brass lamps. Long enough to see a symbol on the wall that matched one he had seen in the oldest biblical manuscripts, a symbol for the heavens, for what comes from above, for beings descending. Then the door closed, and he was alone in the corridor again, heart pounding, knowing he was running out of time before someone noticed. The Sumerian civilization is the oldest we know, the very first, writing, mathematics, law, agriculture, governance systems, all pioneered there, all emerging mysteriously around 5,000 years ago from nowhere, fully formed, as if they had been taught. And 5,000 years ago, they possessed knowledge that seems impossible for that era. Sophisticated systems of astronomy that could calculate the positions of planets invisible to the naked eye. Deep understanding of planetary movements and orbital mechanics. Star maps with such precision that they required either advanced instruments we have no evidence of, or inherited knowledge from elsewhere. And in their tablets, repeatedly, methodically, they mention the Annunaki. Not as gods in abstract sense, not as metaphors for natural forces, as entities, as beings with names, missions, hierarchies, and purposes. Named individuals who held specific positions in a chain of command. The text described them coming from Nibiru, a planet in our solar system that modern astronomy cannot find or chooses not to acknowledge, a 12th planet that should exist based on orbital calculations, but remains hidden. They came to mine gold. They came to transform the planet. They came to create a workforce that could do the heavy labor mining requires. They took the local hominids and modified them. Modified them genetically, created a hybrid being, us, Homo sapiens. The tablets describe this process in meticulous, technical detail. The genetic manipulation, the experiments that failed, the generations required to stabilize the hybrid, the specific assignments given to initial human populations, how to breed them, how to control them, how to keep them subservient. It reads like a technical manual, not mythological poetry, not religious allegory, not philosophical speculation. It reads like a colonization report. The young priest knew his translation was accurate because he had studied Sumerian for years. He knew the vocabulary, the grammar, the idioms, the nuances. There was no ambiguity in what he was reading. The Sumerian scribes were not speaking metaphorically. They were documenting historical fact, recording events that happened, and the Vatican possessed texts confirming this. Not Sumerian translations done by academics or scholars, not copies made by universities, but original tablets, original clay, original stylus marks, originals that had disappeared from museums decades ago, originals that had been quietly gathered by the church over centuries through channels most people would never guess. Why would the Vatican collect ancient Sumerian tablets about extraterrestrial beings? Why hide them so carefully in the deepest vaults? Why guard them with protocols more strict than the most classified theological documents? Unless the truth was dangerous to faith itself. The tablets describe the Annunaki with precision that reads like military documentation. They had a leader, Anu, a supreme commander, a hierarchy beneath him, structured, organized, ruthless. They had names we would recognize from ancient religions across cultures: Enki, Enlil, Ninhursag, Ninurta, names that appear in Sumerian texts, Egyptian mythology, biblical references, Hindu traditions, cultures separated by thousands of miles that had no recorded contact. These were not myths. They were officers in an extraterrestrial expedition, commanders of specific sectors, scientists, administrators, guards. They had divisions of labor, areas of authority, even conflicts between factions. The tablets describe fierce disputes about how to handle the human creation. Some Anunnaki wanted humanity to remain enslaved permanently. Dumb workers serving masters. Others wanted to teach them, elevate them, share knowledge, develop them into conscious partners. This internal conflict mirrors exactly the biblical narrative of the fall of man, of angels who came to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge, who then faced punishment for it. The story of the Watchers who descended and mated with human women. The story of Prometheus stealing fire for mankind. The parallels are too specific, too detailed, too consistent across cultures to be coincidental. The tablets describe the Anunnaki taking human women and creating offspring with them. Hybrid beings, Nephilim, giants. The Bible uses the exact same terminology, the same word, Nephilim. It refers to these hybrid beings repeatedly, describing them as mighty men, men of renown, and then suddenly stops mentioning them as if the topic became forbidden, as if describing them became dangerous. The tablets explain what happened to them. They were systematically eliminated. A decision was made by the Anunnaki Council. Humanity would be kept in controlled ignorance, given just enough knowledge to be useful, enough to work and produce, but not enough to pose a threat, not enough to rebel, not enough to reach for power. They would be worshipped as gods to keep them psychologically compliant. This control system would be maintained through intermediaries, through priests, through religious structures, through carefully controlled narratives passed down from generation to generation. The priest reading these tablets realized something chilling that made him feel cold in his own body. The Vatican was not opposing the Anunnaki agenda. It had never been opposing it. It was enforcing it, maintaining it, protecting it. keeping humanity exactly where the ancient beings had decreed they should remain. Knowledge compartmentalized, truth hidden, population controlled through faith and fear and confusion. The Sumerian tablets repeatedly connect the Anunnaki to specific locations and events in the Bible in ways that are too precise to be accidental. The creation of Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, the flood that destroyed most of humanity, the Tower of Babel, and the sudden emergence of different languages and cultures. All of these major biblical events are explained in the tablets with cause and effect. They describe specific decisions made by the Anunnaki Council, interventions in human affairs, punishments for those who violated the protocol, rewards for those who remained obedient. All matching the biblical narrative perfectly, just with radically different interpretation. The Bible presents God as a single, omnipotent being, infinitely wise, infinitely just. The tablets present the Anunnaki as a hierarchical organization of beings with limited power, competing agendas, and fallible decision-making. One interpretation creates a much different picture of humanity's relationship to the divine. The other creates a relationship to cosmic colonizers, masters and servants. The priest found references to the Watchers in the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered only recently and still not fully understood. The same term the Sumerians used for the Anunnaki. He found astronomical references that matched Sumerian star maps perfectly. He found genealogies that traced bloodlines back to the original hybrid humans, the Nephilim, and every time he found one piece of evidence, he would search the archives desperately for corroborating documents. And every time, he found them, buried in catalogues, restricted with warnings, marked with red ink indicating they were for internal theological study only, and no, T for public knowledge. The pattern was undeniable. The Vatican had systematically collected and hidden the evidence linking biblical narratives directly to Sumerian accounts of the Anunnaki. Someone in the church hierarchy knew. Someone had known for a very long time. Centuries, perhaps for as long as the church had existed. And they had constructed an entire theological system to obscure this knowledge from the world. History, as we are taught it, contains gaps, massive gaps, enormous blanks in the archaeological record that no one talks about. Civilizations appear suddenly, with sophisticated knowledge already developed, as if they were taught. Architecture defying explanation, with the tools supposedly available to them. Precision engineering that requires mathematics we claim they didn't possess. Mathematics and astronomy advanced beyond what should be possible for people we believe were primitive. Technology with no origin story, no developmental progression, just suddenly existing. These gaps are where the Anunnaki story fits like a key into a lock. The tablets describe the Anunnaki teaching humans how to build, how to farm using specific techniques, how to govern using specific structures, how to organize society in ways that would keep them controllable. But they also describe systematically removing that knowledge during periods when humanity became too independent, too questioning, too close to discovering the truth about their origins. The priest found records in the Vatican suggesting the church had always been aware of these removals. Evidence of technological regressions, knowledge disappearing between one generation and the next, civilizations reverting to earlier stages, libraries burning, scholars being silenced, and they documented it not as tragedy or accident, but as policy. Necessary interventions to prevent human civilization from rising beyond a certain threshold, to prevent us from achieving the knowledge and power to challenge the Anunnaki order. The timeline in the tablets contradicted official Christian history, radically, completely. It placed the Anunnaki influence going back hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years. It described multiple cycles of advancement and regression, humanity rising, then being knocked back down, rising again, then suppressed. It suggested that many of the historical empires we believe to be independently created were actually manifestations of Anunnaki-guided development. Egypt didn't arise on its own. It was guided. Babylon didn't emerge from nowhere. It was established. Rome didn't develop naturally. It was directed. The priest realized the Vatican had to know about these timeline discrepancies because the evidence was right there in their archives. Yet the Church taught a linear history to the world. A history beginning with Adam and Eve, proceeding through a specific narrative, arriving at the present day. An official timeline that made no room for extraterrestrial intervention or cyclical history. An official timeline that erased the Anunnaki completely. The Church had built its entire chronological system around hiding these connections. The risk of the truth being known is immense, catastrophic. If humanity learns that civilization was deliberately seeded by extraterrestrial beings for the purpose of creating a slave workforce, everything changes. Everything falls apart. The concept of original sin no longer applies the same way because we didn't fall from grace. We were created without grace. Humanity was created by conscious design for a specific purpose, not out of divine love, but out of pragmatic need. Religion becomes understood not as a path to salvation, but as a control mechanism, a system for maintaining the order the Anunnaki established. The authority of the Church, based on its claim to be the exclusive holder of God's word, becomes fragile and exposed. If God is not the supreme being described in Scripture, if God is not all-powerful and all-knowing, but rather one being among others, many others, beings with limitations and agendas, then the entire hierarchical religious system collapses. The Pope is no longer God's representative on earth. He becomes something far more sinister, a custodian of lies, a guardian of enslaved humanity. The priest understood this completely. The Vatican understood this completely. That is why the evidence was hidden so carefully, so thoroughly. Not because it was false, but because it was true, and truth was more dangerous than any lie the Church could construct. The order had come down through centuries of papal succession. Suppress the Anunnaki connection, eliminate references to it, integrate the truth into doctrine where possible, but alter it so thoroughly that it becomes unrecognizable. Create parallel theological systems. One carefully edited system for the educated elite in the Church, containing hints of truth encoded in allegory. One simplified system for the masses, pure control. Tell the world what they need to believe to remain obedient and compliant. Keep the rest locked away in vaults beneath the ground. The priest found memos during his research, actual written directives, from medieval cardinals discussing how to reconcile Sumerian accounts with Christian doctrine. Handwritten letters debating how much truth could be safely revealed to the world without triggering a collapse of faith. They debated and concluded that none of it could be, not one word. They created elaborate systems of metaphor, allegory, and mystical interpretation to bury the literal truth beneath layers of theology that sounded profound and holy but meant nothing. Theology designed to obscure rather than illuminate. In the deepest vault, protected behind iron and blessed with holy water, the priest discovered texts labelled as the Book of Enoch, but not the version known to scholars and theologians, a version predating every known copy, a version written in a hybrid of Sumerian and Old Aramaic that only a handful of linguists could possibly read. It described encounters with the Anunnaki in explicit, undeniable detail. It named them individually. It described their appearance with precision, how tall they were, the colour of their skin, the nature of their eyes. It described their clothing and equipment. It explained their technology using terms that, when translated and understood through the lens of ancient observers describing advanced machinery, made perfect sense. Chariots of light, wings of the heavens, living metal that defied rust, tools that moved with thought. The original Book of Enoch, as the world knows it from the Dead Sea Scrolls and Ethiopian texts, is fragmentary, poetic, metaphorical, deliberately obscured. The version locked in the Vatican vault was technical, procedural, medical. It read like a report from an observer documenting events, cataloguing them, understanding them. The priest realized the official Book of Enoch had been carefully constructed to preserve some memory of the original, while rendering it sufficiently obscure that modern readers would dismiss it as religious poetry rather than historical account. Translation after translation had layered metaphor upon metaphor, obscuring the literal truth beneath artistic language. The sealed version explained what happened to Enoch. He was not simply taken to heaven as the official version claims. He was taken by the Annunaki for purposes that the texts hint at but do not fully explain. Given access to their knowledge and technology, shown their ships, taught their sciences, and then returned to humanity with specific instructions to warn them. But those instructions were lost. Or were they? The sealed text suggested something different. They suggested Enoch's knowledge was passed down through secret societies, through initiates who understood the truth and worked to preserve it through centuries of suppression. Their symbols appear in the oldest sources, their messages encoded in architecture and art. The final documents the priest found were maps, not simple maps of Earth, though some of those were there too, maps of the stars, ancient star maps showing constellations in positions they had occupied thousands of years ago, definitively proving the maps were created before significant precession shifted the stars. Maps marking the trajectory of Nibiru, the Annunaki homeworld, moving through our solar system in a specific repeating pattern. Calculations of when it would return, maps indicating way stations, routes between worlds, areas marked for specific purposes. Resources, landing sites, areas of habitation. The maps were incredibly sophisticated, far more sophisticated than anything medieval or Renaissance cartographers could have created. They had to have been copied from much older originals, and they had to have been created by beings who travelled routinely between worlds and marked the routes they took, just as modern ships mark routes across oceans. He held these maps in his hands and understood something profound. Humanity had always known we were not alone. We had not discovered in recent years that life existed elsewhere. We had simply been made to forget, systematically, purposefully. The evidence was everywhere, if you knew where to look and what you were looking for. In the oldest texts, in the oldest buildings, in the oldest stories, preserved in the deepest layers of cultures worldwide that had no known contact with each other. The same stories told in different languages, describing the same beings descending from the sky. The Annunaki appearing in Kultu, res separated by oceans and mountains. The Vatican had collected it all over centuries, not to preserve knowledge for future generations, but to contain it, to suppress it, to prevent the world from seeing the truth that connected every ancient civilization to the same cosmic event. He stepped back from the maps, his mind reeling. He had seen enough, he understood enough, and he knew he could not remain silent. But there was more, so much more. Documents that explained where the Annunaki went, why they left, what they left behind. Instructions hidden in plain sight. Warnings encoded in ancient languages, prophecies about their return. And the Vatican had all of it. Locked away, guarded, protected by an oath of silence that stretched back further than Christianity itself. The genetic evidence is what broke him. Not the tablets, not the prophecies, not even the explicit instructions describing the creation of humanity. It was the genetic evidence. Because genetics is science, you cannot hide it behind allegory or metaphor. You cannot interpret it poetically. The DNA is what it is, and in a sealed laboratory 3 levels below the public archives, he found samples, actual genetic samples, some in glass vials, carefully dated from the 1920s, preserved in amber and specialized compounds, labels indicating they had come from archaeological digs across Mesopotamia, Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, examined and tested by the most brilliant minds the Vatican could employ in absolute secrecy. The reports were devastating in their clarity. They showed genetic markers that appeared in certain human populations with no evolutionary explanation. Markers that matched no known primate ancestor. Markers that suggested deliberate insertion, intentional modification at a level so sophisticated that modern genetics could barely comprehend it. The priest understood what he was reading. These genetic sequences suggested that Homo sapiens was not a natural evolutionary development. It was engineered, created through precise genetic manipulation by beings with knowledge far beyond what we possess even today. The Vatican had the proof. They had actual samples and comprehensive analysis done by geneticists who then never published a word of their findings, who then vanished from academic circles, who lived quiet lives of privilege in Vatican-controlled properties, dependent entirely on the Church for their continued existence and silence. The genetic evidence proved the Sumerian texts were not metaphorical. They were literal accounts of genetic engineering. The Annunaki had not descended from the sky and simply inspired humanity. They had taken existing hominids and deliberately rewritten their DNA, created a hybrid being, us. The modifications were not random. They were targeted, specific sequences inserted, others removed. The creation of consciousness itself appeared to be an accident or a calculated gift, depending on how you read the tablets. But regardless of intent, the result was a being capable of thought, of question, of rebellion. And that terrified the designers. The priest found notes from Vatican geneticists discussing markers still being expressed, in certain populations, bloodlines that carried more Annunaki DNA than others, elite families that possessed genetic advantages, not visible but measurable. This explains so much: the belief in bloodline, the emphasis on purity, the careful breeding programs documented in Vatican records. The priest realized the Vatican was sitting on evidence that would revolutionize biology, that would force us to rewrite every textbook on human origins, that would prove evolution was not the complete story, not by far. But they kept it locked away because releasing it would topple everything. Faith would be questioned. The authority of the Church would become meaningless. And the control system the Annunaki had put in place, the system the Vatican was protecting and enforcing, would be exposed for Jubuage. That it truly was, not divine guidance but cosmic manipulation, not salvation but subjugation. But humanity has always been royalty in waiting. That concept appears in cultures separated by continents and centuries. Kings descended from the gods, rulers who were literally born of divine beings and human women. Royal bloodlines traced directly to the heavens. Not metaphorically, literally. The tablets explain this with precision. The kingship, the concept that certain humans were selected to rule, not because they earned it or because they were voted on, but because they carried the bloodline, the genetic legacy of the Annunaki themselves. These beings of the sky chose partners among humanity and created offspring. Those offspring became kings, became emperors, became the ones chosen to rule vast empires and maintain order. The Annunaki had created a system of perpetual control through bloodline. As long as the rulers could trace their ancestry back to the gods, they had legitimacy. They had power granted by forces beyond human understanding. And the priesthood would maintain the records, keeping the bloodline alive in memory and in carefully controlled genealogies. Pharaohs of Egypt were not just kings. They were descendants, divine descendants, half-gods. That is why they were treated as gods themselves. That is why their word was law. That is why they commanded absolute obedience. The same pattern appears in Mesopotamian kings, Sumerian rulers who claimed descent from Anu and Enlil directly. The tablets give the genealogies, real genealogies, names and generations stretching back to the moment the hybrid beings were created. And these genealogies show up in modified form in biblical texts, genealogies edited and altered to remove the obvious implications. The Vatican had recognized the pattern. Kingship descended from heaven, and they had realized that the Church itself needed to inherit this power. The Church could not allow secular rulers to claim divine legitimacy if that legitimacy came from the Annunaki directly. So the Church had gradually usurped that power, declaring themselves the interpreters of divine will, claiming authority not from genetics but from theological position, becoming, in essence, the new priesthood maintaining control through religious doctrine rather than through genetic legitimacy. The priest understood this was a calculated move. The Church did not oppose the kingship concept because they did not believe it. They opposed it because they wanted to control it, to claim it for themselves, to be the ones deciding who held power and who did not. That is why they guarded the genealogies so carefully, not to protect secrets, but to protect their monopoly on interpretation of those secrets. Archaeological sites across the Middle East are under Vatican protection. Not officially, not openly, but practically and systematically. The priest found documentary evidence of this, agreements made with governments, funding provided to ensure excavations happen in certain directions, funding withdrawn when excavations threatened to uncover the wrong things, sites that should have been excavated decades ago, sitting untouched because the Vatican quietly discouraged the work. The Tel Mardik in Syria, Ur in Iraq, Lagash, Kish, Nippur, all centres of Sumerian civilization, all sites where cuneiform tablets have been found that describe the Annunaki directly. And the Vatican has been systematically acquiring these sites through various channels, buying adjacent land, funding museums and institutions that control access, placing Vatican-trained archaeologists in key positions, ensuring that when important discoveries are made, they can be acquired before they reach public record. The priest found evidence of tablets purchased secretly from looters, archaeological surveys funded not to discover, but to prevent discovery, sites declared off-limits for political or religious reasons that just happened to be locations where crucial evidence might emerge. There was a dig in the 1970s near the ancient city of Uruk that was shut down after the first month. The director had found something. Written reports indicated tablets describing Anunnaki spacecraft, technology, devices for flight, and for the manipulation of matter. The excavation was stopped, funding disappeared. The director was offered a position at a Vatican university if he would move to Rome and work in their private research division. He accepted. His work was never published. The site was never reopened. The Vatican had essentially purchased silence with opportunity. The priest found references to a monastery in Eastern Europe that housed collections of Sumerian artifacts that were never catalogued. A private museum operated by the Church where genuine archaeological discoveries sat behind glass, studied only by Vatican-approved scholars. Entire collections of material evidence that the world did not know existed. The priest obtained a list through careful observation, 73 major Sumerian sites, every single one either owned by the Vatican, controlled by Vatican-approved foundations, or cordoned off from public access. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. This was a campaign, a systematic acquisition of all locations where primary evidence of the Anunnaki could be found and studied. The excavations that did happen on these sites were always supervised by Vatican archaeologists. The finds always went to Vatican-controlled museums or archives. The reports were never published in peer-reviewed journals. The information flow was completely contained. Sites under Vatican control became sites under Vatican suppression. The world was denied access to evidence that would change human history because the Church had quietly positioned itself as the guardian of those sites. And once you own the evidence, you control the narrative around it. The mining of gold. This is what truly drove it. This is what the Anunnaki came to Earth for in the first place. Not to help humanity, not to seed intelligent life out of cosmic benevolence. They came because our world had something they needed. Gold. Specifically, monatomic gold. Gold with special properties. Properties used in their technology, used in their spacecraft, used in their communication devices, used in ways human science was only beginning to understand. The tablets describe massive mining operations in Africa and South America, coordinated by the Annunaki, worked by human slaves, gold extracted on a scale that suggests industrial processing. That suggests machines. That suggests organization and infrastructure requiring centuries of sustained effort. Archaeological evidence supports this. Massive earthworks in Peru and Bolivia that make no sense unless you understand they were mining operations. Strange geoglyphs in the mountains that align with specific star positions. Positions that would have made sense from the perspective of someone arriving from space. Arrival routes marked into the landscape. The priest found maps in the Vatican showing these ancient mining sites. Maps created within the last few centuries. Maps indicating that the church had verified the locations. That the church understood what these sites represented. The gold mining continued even after the Anunnaki left. Humans continued the work, became obsessed with gold, created religions around it, built empires to control it, and the priesthood, throughout history, has been the primary controller of gold reserves. The Vatican itself is incomprehensibly wealthy. Gold holds most of that wealth. And now the question becomes obvious. Where did that gold come from? How did the church accumulate such vast quantities? Was it simply through tithes and donations over centuries? Or was the church mining the same sources the Anunnaki had mined? Continuing the work, maintaining the operation, using the same equipment, possibly, following maps left behind. The tablets describe equipment left buried at mining sites, equipment that would still function, equipment that required only knowledge to operate. The priest wondered if somewhere in the Vatican, or in sites Vatican controlled, this equipment still existed, still functioned, still served purposes the world would never understand. The gold continued to flow, the mining continued, the conspiracy continued, and the church, inheriting the mantle of the Anunnaki, continued their work with the same ruthlessness, the same efficiency, the same absolute commitment to control. The architecture tells the story, if you know how to read it. Cathedrals are not just buildings, they are statements. They are inscriptions in stone of knowledge that cannot be spoken aloud. The priest walked through churches with new eyes and began to see patterns he had never noticed. Proportions matching the Anunnaki ships described in the tablets. Angles corresponding to the approach trajectories described in cuneiform. Windows positioned to allow light to strike specific stones on specific days of the year. Days that aligned with astronomical events, tied to Nibiru's orbit. The spiral. That symbol appeared everywhere in sacred architecture. In mosaics, in stained glass, in floor plans. The spiral is the symbol of creation in the oldest Sumerian tradition. The representation of the Anunnaki DNA being inserted into the human genome, a biological spiral turned into an eternal symbol, carved into stone, repeated in every cathedral built by the church for 1,000 years. Not consciously understood by most architects, but passed down, repeated. A symbol of control, a symbol of origin, a reminder carved into buildings that the church had inherited the role of the Anunnaki. The labyrinth appears in many cathedrals, a puzzle, a path that seems to lead nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. The priest realized these were not just decorative features, they were maps, maps of the journey, maps of the initiation process, maps of how to ascend through levels of knowledge. The deeper you went into the labyrinth, the closer you came to the center, and those who could navigate it were those who understood the truth. Others would remain lost forever in its corridors. The symbols in the architecture were a language. They spoke of spacecraft, of the mechanics of genetic modification, of the hierarchy of the Anunnaki, of the plans for future return. Sacred geometry translated into stone. The priest found diagrams in Vatican archives showing the geometric relationships between major cathedrals. They were not randomly placed. They formed patterns, connected by invisible lines that mapped onto star charts. The placement of churches across Europe followed the same coordinates as the ancient Sumerian temple complexes. It was a replica, a mirror. The Vatican was building a planetary system of knowledge sites, each one a node in a network, each one positioned to receive and transmit something, information perhaps, or energy, or something the priest could not quite understand, but recognized as important. The priest understood that the builders had known, not all of them, but the designers, the architects, the ones who drew the plans. They had known what they were building, and they had encoded that knowledge in every arch, every pillar, every stone laid with precise intention. But the cover-up is modern, and it is precise. The priest understood that the older suppression was about removing knowledge, about burning books and hiding tablets, about killing scholars who asked too many questions. But modern suppression is different. It is more sophisticated. It is about controlling access to information rather than eliminating it. It is about framing the narrative, about deciding what gets studied and what gets dismissed, about placing Vatican-approved scholars in positions of authority where they can guide research in safe directions. The academic world had been infiltrated, not dramatically, not through obvious force, but systematically, carefully. Vatican funding for research institutes, Vatican grants for archaeological programs, Vatican positions offered to ambitious scholars who are willing to work within certain parameters. Once inside the system, they become gatekeepers. They decide what research gets published, what theories get serious consideration, what gets relegated to pseudoscience and conspiracy thinking. The priest found a document listing hundreds of scholars, brilliant minds, once promising researchers. All of them had been offered Vatican grants. All of them had begun to publish carefully within parameters. All of them had slowly become less ambitious, less questioning, more focused on safe questions that posed no threat. Any scholar who got too close to the real truth found their funding disappeared, their papers rejected, their credibility destroyed not through direct attack, but through the quiet mechanisms of academic politics. Peer review becomes a weapon. The priest found evidence of this. Letters from Vatican officials to university administrators. Funding offers withdrawn when a researcher's work started heading in dangerous directions. Research proposals rejected before they were even evaluated on merit. Grant applications denied at the foundation level. A coordinated effort spanning decades, spanning multiple countries, appearing organic and natural from the outside. Academic consensus seems to emerge naturally from the evidence, but it emerges because the evidence has been carefully curated, because the research has been carefully guided, because the questions allowed to be asked are limited to safe territory. Those who ask dangerous questions find themselves isolated. Their funding dries up. Their employment becomes precarious. The pressure is not force, it is something subtler. The withdrawal of opportunity, the loss of position, and the slow realization that pursuing certain truths has a cost. The internet has complicated this. Information flows faster. It is harder to control. So the modern strategy has become not to suppress but to drown, to create such an overwhelming flood of information and misinformation that no one can distinguish truth from lies anymore. To make conspiracy thinking the default response to anything outside mainstream narrative, to make people suspicious of all claims and all evidence, to create a cultural moment where nothing can be believed and everything is speculation. The priest realized this was perhaps the most diabolical suppression of all. Not removal of truth, but drowning in falsehood. Not hiding evidence, but burying it under mountains of contradictory information. The Vatican had adapted. Modern technology meant modern suppression. More sophisticated, more complete, more impossible to escape or even recognize. The truth gets lost, not because it is hidden, but because it is indistinguishable from lies. What the Church still guards is not just the tablets, not just the genetic samples, not just the maps and the prophecies. What the church guards is the future. They have knowledge of what is coming. The tablets describe the return. The Annunaki will return. Not in metaphorical sense, in literal sense. Their planet, Nibiru, follows an orbital pattern, thousands of years per orbit, but the orbit is returning. The return is approaching. The Vatican knows this. They have the calculations, they have the timeline, and they have spent centuries preparing for that return. Building structures that will survive, preserving knowledge that will be useful, positioning power in such a way that when the Anunnaki return, the church will be the intermediary, the communication point, the authority that who stands what is happening and can control how humanity responds. The priest found documents discussing this, plans made centuries ago, long-term strategies spanning generations, each pope receiving briefing on the timeline, each cardinal in the inner circle understanding what is at stake, the broader priesthood kept in the dark, the world kept in the dark, but the leadership knew. They knew the return was coming, and they had prepared. There were contingency plans, plans for how to present the return to a world that had been kept ignorant, plans for how to frame it, how to spin it, how to maintain control even as the sky opened and the Anunnaki descended once again. The Vatican had even prepared monuments, buildings designed to last, structures built to be impressive, to beings accustomed to cosmic engineering. The architecture itself was a message, a welcome, a greeting written in stone for those who had created humanity and were coming back to check on their investment. The priest understood they were preparing to meet their makers, and they wanted to do so not as equals but as representatives, as the authority that had maintained order during the absence, as the institution that had kept humanity in the subordinate position it had been assigned. The Vatican was not protecting the secret out of protection of faith. They were protecting the secret because they wanted to control the future interaction. They wanted to be in a position to negotiate, to maintain power, to preserve their role as intermediaries between humanity and the gods. When the gods returned, the church won, Ted to still be in charge. Everything made sense through this lens. The suppression, the hiding, the careful control. It was not just about the past, it was about the future, and the future was almost here. The Vatican had been preparing for millennia, and all of humanity had been kept in darkness because the church believed it was the only institution capable of managing the truth when it finally arrived. The theological crisis this creates is unfathomable. Because if the Anunnaki created humanity, then what does that mean for the concept of God, for the concept of soul, for the concept of salvation and sin and everything the church teaches? The priest wrestled with this in the darkness of the archives. The Bible presents God as all-powerful, all-knowing, infinitely just and merciful. But the tablets present the Anunnaki as beings with limitations, beings who aged, who got sick, who disagreed with each other, who made mistakes, who were sometimes cruel and sometimes kind, but always self-serving. They were advanced, but they were not infinite. They were not divine in any sense except that they possessed power over those less advanced. Power and divinity have been conflated throughout human history, but they are not the same thing. The Anunnaki were powerful, but they were not divine. They created humans, not out of love, but out of need. Not to populate a world they were giving as a gift, but to create workers, to create slaves. The theological implications are staggering. Original sin was not a fall from grace, it was a limitation imposed by design. Humans were created limited, created to fear and obey, created to worship the Anunnaki as gods. That worship structure, that psychological tendency to look upward to authority that was built into us. The church had inherited that structure. They had recognized it, and they had maintained it, taken the place of the Anunnaki, and demanded the same obedience, the same worship, the same unquestioning compliance. The priest realized the CI Hirsch was not protecting divine truth. It was protecting a system of control, a system that would collapse the moment humanity understood that they were equals being held in artificial subjugation, that they had been lied to about their origins, that they had been manipulated, that the entire religious system was built on the perpetuation of a cosmic lie. And when the truth emerged, when it became undeniable, when people finally understood what they were, the entire theological structure would crumble. The church would lose all authority, and something new would have to be built, something based on actual truth rather than maintained illusion. That terrified the leadership. That terror was why they kept the secret so carefully guarded. That terror was why they would do anything to preserve the lie. The return prophecy appears in fragments throughout the sealed texts, references to the returning, the day when Nibiru would once again be visible in the sky, when the Annunaki would descend, when they would reclaim their creation, judge it, possibly discard it. The timeline is approaching. Within this century or the next, the calculations are precise, astronomical, verifiable. Once Nibiru becomes visible to the naked eye, the secret can no longer be kept. The world will see, and then the chaos begins. The priest understood why the Vatican wanted to be in control when that moment arrived. If the people learned about the return through panic and confusion and wild speculation, there would be terror, there would be violence, there would be a complete breakdown of society. But if the Church would manage the revelation, could frame it properly, could position itself as the authority that understands and can negotiate, then control could be maintained even through that transformation. The Annunaki, returning to find the world still in religious order, still honouring hierarchies, still accepting authority, still prepared for subjugation. That was what the Vatican was building toward. That was the entire purpose of the modern cover-up and control, maintaining order for the moment of return. But the priest could not remain silent anymore. He could not watch the lies continue, could not see the world kept in ignorance, while the institutions of power prepared for a future that belonged to those who knew the truth. He had walked away. He had left behind the collar and the vows and the comfortable position in a system that was fundamentally rotten at its core. And now he was telling you, telling all of you, because the truth, even terrible truth, even a truth that shatters everything you believe you know, is always better than a lie, maintained by force. The Vatican is not protecting your faith, it is protecting its power. It is not preserving sacred knowledge, it is preserving control. And when you finally understand this, when you finally see the truth about who created you and about the beings who descended from the sky and shaped human destiny for their own purposes, about the church that inherited that role and perpetuated it, about the return that is coming, about the future that is approaching, you will understand that everything you were taught was layers of deception built to keep you obedient, compliant, submissive. The tablets are real, the genetic evidence is real, the prophecy is real, and the Vatican knows.